Right. Welcome everyone to our first 2025 Permafrost Discovery Gateway webinar series. And today, so the webinar series is for the community interested in permafrost thaw hazards and permafrost science, and especially when it comes to big geospatial data and how we can make science helpful for the people living and working in the Arctic. And today, I am so very excited to have Johanna present here for us on her work in Greenland on the infrastructure and permafrost thaw. And so we'll have her present for the first half, and then we'll have the second half devoted for discussion and questions. And I want to introduce Johanna for you two here as well. So Johanna is currently employed as a postdoctoral fellow at Umeå University, working as part of an EU-funded ILUC project to investigate the impacts of permafrost thaw and legacy industrial sites on vegetation and ecosystems in Canada. So her research includes permafrost thaw risks, interdisciplinary approaches to risk assessment, and geospatial sciences. And after obtaining an engineering degree in environmental and geosciences in France, she completed her PhD at the Technical University of Denmark, where she implemented a multidisciplinary hazard mapping framework for permafrost infrastructure, on permafrost in Greenland. And that is what she will present on here today. Thank you, Johanna. Go for it.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for attending. I have to say I do not have a very long experience working with permafrost thaw related issues in the Arctic, but I'm really glad to have this opportunity to present my PhD work, which basically consisted in mapping the susceptibility of roads to those settlements in Greenland. So my PhD was part of a larger interdisciplinary project, which was called Nunatarjuk, and which focused on the various impacts of permafrost thaw on coastal Arctic communities. And yes, that works. So my presentation will be divided in two main parts, and if I have the time, I do have some thoughts for the future that I would be happy to share and receive feedbacks on. But I would say that one of the most important part of my work was to actually understand what is a hazard and what is a risk, and broadening my understanding of these concepts, I think really shaped the way I approach this susceptibility mapping work. So I will start with discussing a bit these concepts. And in the second part, I will present our case study, which is Ilulissat, and I will take you through the methodological approach that we implemented. I have to say also that it was not a straightforward and perfect process, so I will also reflect on the limitations of this study, and I hope it will be useful for future work. Okay, so as we know, there are many different types of permafrost thaw-induced hazards, including coastal erosion, flooding, those slumps, and those settlements, which will be the topic of my presentation. So basically, any changes in surface characteristic and permafrost properties may trigger hazards, which will eventually result in infrastructure failure. I think it's important to remember that, of course, climate change has a big importance in permafrost degradation processes, but in engineering contexts, the way we build and the way we maintain infrastructure on permafrost can also have negative impacts on the ground thermal regime. So basically, the likelihood of ground surface deformations depend on three main parameters, which are the geological setting, the thermal regime, and the water or ice availability of the geological substrate. And I would say that what we are the most interested in mapping is the ground ice content, but it's also a parameter that is very difficult to spatially assess. And so, for example, we tend to use proxies such as the sediment type. So as we know, typically clays and silts are very frost susceptible, because they are fine grained, and so they are prone to form segregated ice and therefore to result in those settlements upon thawing. So these hazards and infrastructure failures have a wide range of consequences, which of course includes direct cost of repairs and maintenance, but also have negative impacts on, for example, traditional lifestyles, mobility of communities, and well-being. So I think in an engineering context, we are used to define risk as the probability of a hazard to occur multiplied by the severity of the consequences. But if we take a step back, we can see that similar physical processes and permafrost degradation hazards can occur across the Arctic and be similar in different communities. However, the way Arctic communities perceive the risks and the way they manage this risk is influenced by a lot of different factors, including, for example, the political, the historical, the economic, and the social setting. So my point here is that the concept of risk can be way more complex than the traditional probabilistic approach. And I think this is something that we are typically lacking in engineering studies. It's comprehensive and holistic risk assessment framework. And it's important to understand that depending on the study area, the local concerns, the data that are available, the risk definitions and the way we assess risk or map hazards may vary. So if we look at the circumpolar scale, I think we all know that an important proportion of infrastructure is currently at risk or will be at risk from permafrost thaw in the coming year under future climate scenarios. And if we look at this table, we can see that linear infrastructure, and particularly roads, are expected to generate important maintenance and replacement costs in the futures. So this type of study, I think, is very important to raise awareness, and we really need to assess what will be the socioeconomic impacts of permafrost thaw hazard and infrastructure failure. However, there are some issues. First of all, usually these maps are way too coarse to be used at a local scale, of course. And another problem when we look at the assessment of socioeconomic costs is that Greenland is very often underrepresented due to the lack of data, or as we can see here, substantial permafrost infrastructure. But I think there is still a need for high-resolution hazard maps and risk assessment framework that take into consideration both the current and the future permafrost and infrastructure conditions. And we also need these maps to support the decision-making, try to help prioritizing maintenance operation and optimize resources. So I think to exemplify my point, I will take you directly to Ilulissat, which is located on the west coast of Greenland here. It is the third town in Greenland and also the seat of the Avananta municipality, which is represented in this light blue color. It has approximately 5,000 inhabitants, and the population has been increasing slightly in the recent years because it's very attractive for tourism, but also for research. One particularity in Greenland is that the settlements are island operated, so there are no roads connecting them. And so you need to access the different communities by plane or by boat. So here is the town development from 1948 to basically nowadays, and what will Ilulissat look like in the future. So the runway is currently under construction and is being extended to accommodate international airplanes and airlines. And for that reason, there is an important need for additional buildings, infrastructure, and eventually to expand onto more sensitive terrains. So what we know about permafrost conditions and the geology is that permafrost is continuous in the region. Mean annual ground temperatures are relatively warm towards -2, -3 degrees. And this is basically the typical soil profile that we find in these sedimentary basins. So below the active layer, you would have a very ice-rich permafrost, and then it would become saline with depth, which makes permafrost very sensitive to any type of disturbances. Because of this characteristic, the main hazard feature that we find in the area are those settlements, and this is why we're particularly interested in mapping them. So we have maintained a continuous dialogue with the municipality, and we were able to organize consultation meetings through the project with actors from the construction and planning sectors. And we basically identified a long list of challenges. And so one thing to know about construction practices in Greenland is that buildings and houses are typically established on bedrock outcrop. So sometimes you also see these types of scenarios where they have to dig down to the bedrock table. They would cast pile and then eventually backfill with the excavated material. So it's an expensive and sometimes a process that comes with bad surprises when the bedrock is very deep and there is not enough information beforehand to estimate the depth. But generally speaking, houses in Ilulissat and buildings are not so much affected by those settlements. The main issue for the municipality who is responsible for most of the maintenance are the roads, which are usually sacrificed and placed across these sensitive ice-rich sedimentary basins and are therefore very affected by differential those settlements. Like many other regions of the Arctic, I think there is also a lack of human, technical, financial resources. There is also a high turnover rate among the workforce, which makes it difficult to transfer knowledge on the long term. And typically the costs of constructions are very high because you need to bring in either the workforce or the equipment or both. Okay, so I like to compare a bit like what were the original research needs versus the local needs. And in the case of Ilulissat, basically, the municipality particularly needs to know where geotechnical data is available. Do we know the depth to bedrock? Where are those susceptible permafrost areas located, which are unsuitable for constructions or challenging from a maintenance point of view? And finally, I think there is often a lack of understanding of the causes and the total costs that are associated with infrastructure damages, either related to permafrost or not. So how did we address these needs? I have to cite the work that has been done already in Canada, and I think the original idea at the beginning of my PhD was to use a method similar to this one, which consists in basically having a detailed superficial geology map, deriving permafrost conditions from it, and also, for example, having a slope angle as part of the index. But this is basically how the landscape looks in Ilulissat, and we have no detailed maps of the superficial deposits available. The terrain is relatively flat and homogeneous in terms of geomorphology. So based on my expertise, I didn't feel confident with delineating superficial deposits in these basins or identifying different units. So I do not have the time really to go into this work, but I really have to cite studies that have been already conducted in Canada and Alaska, which I think are very inspiring and which really helped me to build the framework for the Thaw Susceptibility Index. As I said before, I was also interested in knowing if there were more comprehensive risk assessments out there. And I found, for example, studies with quantitative versus qualitative approaches that took into consideration some costs, as well as, for example, the potential of damage of the infrastructure. So based on the literature and what I knew from the area, I designed a general workflow which looked like this. And we decided to combine data from 3 main sources. So archives, we conducted field and laboratory investigation, and thanks or because of COVID, we also worked with remote sensing data. And so basically the first step towards deriving and implementing the Thaw Settlement Susceptibility Index was to assess road conditions in the area and the relevant hazard sources. So I do not have a lot of time to go into all of the details, but basically how I proceeded is that I made a list of the different criteria that I found in the literature and that are particularly relevant when assessing permafrost thaw hazards in the vicinity of roads. And I basically developed a very simple and visual assessment of road damages and hazard factors. So I decided to go with this approach basically because currently in Greenland or in the Avanata municipality, there is no systematic and digitized inventory of road conditions and repairs. So what kind of data did I use for this part of the work? So existing data included what is called the technical base map, which is developed by an institute that is owned by the government and which conducts surveys and research projects on climate, soil conditions, etc. So for example, from that source, I had the general delineation of the road network, the different types of surfacing layer, asphalt versus gravel, and they also have orthophotos. I also went through some of the municipal geospatial data and the budgetary reports. And I supplemented this information with manually mapping and digitizing all the damages and local repairs that I observed between 2020 and 2021. So basically, most of the road network is paved in Ilulissat, and I covered approximately 65% of the paved road network. And we also had the opportunity to sit with the technical department, which enabled us to reconstruct the history of the major repavement cycle, which is the main type of repair that is conducted on roads at the moment and which requires the most resources. So here are some examples of the different damages that I observed. I also used a common standard to assess the severity of each of these damages. One thing I think that is not very well understood is the importance of the water drainage system and also snow accumulation in the vicinity of the roads. So I also looked at the culverts and the state of the ditches. And I also obtained some information from the municipality about preferential locations for snow piling along the roads. So this is an example of the type of high-resolution map that I obtained based on the collection of this data. And then, I mean, I had to find a solution to characterize these sedimentary basins and to map basically the ground ice content or find a proxy for it in the area. So once again, I use this technical base map, which provides a simple delineation of the bedrock. My former supervisor also had scanned many physical archives of historical shallow excavation borehole logs that were available in the area. And like I said, we also used Sentinel-2 star images to derive ground surface deformation maps, which completed the punctual information provided by the borehole logs. We also conducted several shallow excavation and drilling campaigns and analyzed samples and permafrost cores in the lab. So here are some examples of the work that was done as part of this. So in total, I think we digitized more than 1,000 logs, both manually because I'm very old-fashioned, but some students also develop a character recognition algorithm for them. And basically, we decided, since we didn't have, it's like historical information, and usually the surveyors that did the the logging don't necessarily have information about the permafrost and the ice content, etc. So let's say that the level of detail in these logs vary significantly. So we used a proxy in order to assess the frost susceptibility, which is the main hazard source for the geological substrate. And we classified these logs based on the presence or absence of fine-grained sediments within the 3 first meter of the soil profile. And here is an example of the average seasonal displacement map that we obtain from using the INSAR time series. So basically, after collecting all these data and based on the nature and the amount of the data that we collected, we decided to formulate the Thaw Settlement Susceptibility Index as a combination of the hazard level, the vulnerability of the road network, and the severity of the consequences. So how did I proceed is that I basically divided first the entire area of the community in approximately 50-meter terrain units, and I also divided the road networks in 50-meter long road sections. And then, so for the hazard level, I assessed it for each terrain unit based on the frost susceptibility of the geological substrate. And I also considered the water and snow accumulation. For the vulnerability, I really wanted to try to think outside of the box. And I inspired myself from the studies that I have mentioned before. So I decided to include factors such as the level of damage translated through a pavement condition index and the vulnerability to traffic disruption. So what I mean by that is that, for example, there are some roads in Ilulissat which do not have alternative routes. For example, the road to the airport. So if there is a major failure, for sure the traffic will be disrupted or completely blocked, and that can have really important impacts if we consider that, for example, we can only access and supply Ilulissat through the air traffic. And finally, for the consequences, I will mention that later, but we do not have enough information and detail regarding the cost. So I used a proxy and I used basically the asphalt repavement frequency. Yes, next. So once again, those are the hazard factors that we considered. I also really wanted to include the embankment design, but unfortunately, we do not have information for each road section. And so this is basically the two types of proxies that I first used to assess the frost susceptibility of the geological substrate. So one proxy derives from the geotechnical data, that is to say the borehole logs, and one proxy derives from the remote sensing data. I think I will not necessarily go into the details here, but I basically classified the geotechnical information hazard levels based on first the overlap with bedrock, then based on the availability of the geotechnical data within that unit. And then we see that we looked at the percentage of fine-grained sediments of logs that were classified as fine-grained. And if there was no geotechnical data available within the hexagon unit, we decided to look at the surrounding hexagons. And based on that, we decided of the hazard level values. So this is an example of the soil type hazard level derived from the geotechnical information. So this is a very heavy map, but basically it represents these borehole logs that we have classified as fine grain versus coarse grain. The dashed versus point patterns represent the availability of the geotechnical data. And finally, the colors of the hexagons represent the soil type hazard level. And so once again, like those are the different maps for the different proxies and the final geological substrate hazard level. And basically we decided that one proxy would prevail over the other based on the availability of the borehole log within the terrain units. We basically proceeded with a similar qualitative workflow to assess hazard level associated with the water and snow ploughing deposits. I think I have to go a bit fast because I'm late. And so basically we reprojected
You're great, Johanna. Yeah, take your time. Thank
the
you.
terrain hazard levels onto the road sections. And so basically for the vulnerability index, as I have said before, we combined two proxies, the level of damage, which was based on reclassified pavement condition going from low to high. And so we also really wanted to assess the vulnerability based on the presence of alternative routes to one road section. So we developed an algorithm to calculate the shortest path between start points and destination points, which were defined in our case as critical infrastructure for the community. So that could be, for example, the airport, the harbor, the municipality, the fire station, etc. And so based on that, we classified road sections with alternative routes, with a low vulnerability, and road sections that do not have alternative routes with as being critical. And this is an example of the type of maps that we obtain. So here you can see like the destination points that we have used. So the main infrastructure for the community. And finally, I will finish with the consequences. So we really wanted to try to include economic data about the costs of maintenance. But the problem is that they are generally registered on a very high level. So you do not necessarily know if the repair was done because of permafrost thaw or because of other things. So what we did is that we used the frequency of the repavement cycles as a proxy. And we considered that if a road section had been repaved once or repaved twice for a period of 5 years, the severity of the consequences would be basically medium. But if there are the road sections that have been like repaved twice in successive years, and in this case, the severity would be high. And so this is the final map that we obtain, multiplying these three components and also overlaying those susceptibility of the different roads onto the initial terrain hazard level. Yeah, and I think I will finish with this because I'm over time, but so I am aware that what I have used in the qualitative approach and the thresholds that we have defined for the different workflows can be considered subjective. So I think there is space for improvement here and to try different methods. I unfortunately think as well that I think the most difficult thing is to combine data sets that are very variable in terms of quality, in terms of quantity, in terms of spatial or temporal distribution. And so that can also vary between communities a lot. So I think it's not necessarily a bad thing to adapt risk or hazard indices to the locality. And I think it's sometimes necessary. Another problem is that some of the data sets I have used are already outdating. So it takes a lot of time to conduct research, but typically in Ilulissat, for example, they need to build fast and they need answers fast. So how do we cope with this problem? I think, yeah, I wish I could have done more. There was, a lot of data that could still be included, and my colleagues will work to try to retrieve more socioeconomic information in the future. And then I think this type of study is a great step to identify areas that are problematic, but there is still a need for site scale modeling. And typically at the municipality, we would be asked, well, what can we do at this specific location? And you cannot really understand if you don't conduct really fine scale studies. Yeah, and something I particularly regret is that I didn't have a lot of time to exchange with locals, and I think that should be prioritized, and also making sure that we make maps that are useful and accessible based on local needs. And yeah, on that, yeah, I would like to acknowledge, of course, like all my collaborators and the funding agencies that have made this project possible. And I thank you for your attention. Sorry for being over time. That was a long work.
Thank you so much, Johanna. Perfect, perfect. Much appreciated. All right, we're going to hand over to the discussion and the questions, and you can put your questions or comments in the chat, or you can just raise your hand or just press unmute. So go for it. We'll open it up. And I'm going to stop recording here now.